Hello, and welcome to another rousing edition of Spy Hard's podcast, where your hosts go deep undercover into the world of spy movies to decipher which films make the knock list. But remember, this information is strictly for your ears only. I'm Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam the Provocateur, climbing into a spider tank.
I actually thought you'd have a different intro line, so I actually now have my outro line saved. This is a first. Thank
Perfect.
the heavens. But I do believe we have a special guest joining us.
That's right. Refusing to send a rabbit to kill a fox. We are joined by Jarrah Hodge, the co-host of the Women at Warp podcast. Jarrah, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Now, Jarrah, back in the day, you were on the Subspace Transmissions podcast with us, and you've gone on to do Women at Warp, which is a very popular Star Trek podcast I recommend to everyone. But maybe you could talk a little bit about how Women at Warp got started and what the show kind of is.
Yeah, so Women at Warp is a bi-weekly podcast where we talk about what we call intersectional diversity in infinite combinations. So basically, gender, race, all sorts of great queer stuff, and social justice commentary related to Star Trek. And we have a rotating crew of 7 women hosts and try to have on a lot of guests from different backgrounds that maybe aren't normally on all of the convention stages and things around Star Trek fandom.
And how many years has the podcast been going now?
7 years, actually. We are, I think we have passed our 7-year anniversary. So now we are, longer than the longest Star Trek series.
It's true.
Are you running out of ideas like season 7's tend to, or is,
Nope.
Is it still firing all cylinders? This is like the true season 8 of TNG we should have had.
Yes, I fully believe so. Yes. There's, partly Star Trek keeps releasing new things now, so that's keeping us all busy. And then there's just a lot of you can mine different like deep dives on characters and episodes, as well as broader themes across more than 50 years of stuff. I think, we started doing a series on women villains, and that alone we thought was going to be an episode, and now it's like 4 episodes, and we probably will have to do future ones.
Have you done one on the villainous side of Janeway and the fact that she killed Tuvix?
We did a Janeway episode, and we also did a hot takes episode where we talked about Tuvix a bit. And I think someone suggested, I think they've done at conventions like a mock trial. So I don't know, maybe that'll be like have patrons unlock that or something, or we could do that on a convention or something. But I feel like I'll say most of the Women at Warp is on Team Tuvix.
I am also on Team Tuvix.
You were very well versed in Star Trek before you started Women at Warp. What have been some discoveries you've made in delving, into the franchise over these past 7 years?
I think that what was really interesting to me is, even though I watched Star Trek, I was really aware of like a lot of kind of, I would say, popular surface narratives in the fandom, like the idea that there is a unified Gene Roddenberry's vision that we can just follow and clearly, cleanly map into the future, and that anything outside of that is not Star Trek. And going back and looking into the history of the fandom and things like the letters that fans were writing in the 60s, as well as like the production memos showed that everything was more complicated. So like, fans were not universally saying, for example, that 60s Star Trek was super progressive for women. So some of them were, and that's totally valid. Some people were like, miniskirts are super empowering. And some people said, this is ridiculous. How can they be expected to do their jobs? So, the idea that I think Star Trek has always had this tension between trying to present a utopian future and being a bit ahead of its time in representation, but there's always been that tension between that and like the reality of the era that the creators and all the hands that are influencing it behind the scenes have lived in, and are kind of inescapable in some ways.
Yeah, I love the story of Women at Warp just because you popped on the Subspace Transmissions, you saw how they did it and realized that that's not a good idea. And then you went and launched a far more successful podcast.
That was exactly
Sorry,
it.
Yeah, that is exactly that. And hopefully from this, you will learn even more things not to do. and grow to be even more successful.
Well, thank you. I appreciate all these opportunities.
Well, I mean, Cam and I met at a Star Trek convention, Star Trek Las Vegas, many, many moons ago now. But we do have a mutual love for Star Trek, but we also have a mutual love for spy movies, and thus the Spy Hards podcast. And because you're joining us and you're stepping off of the Enterprise D into the world of spy movies, I need to ask you a few questions to check your credentials.
Sure. All right.
The first question always is, what's your favorite spy movie?
Okay, so I would say I would not call myself a spy movie expert, but I've seen like a fair number of the classics. My favorite is definitely Notorious. I'm a Hitchcock fan, so wherever Hitchcock, and also like more of the ones that kind of go into spy territory than the ones that go into stabbing in the shower territory, although also enjoyable. I just love the plotting and the atmosphere and the acting and characterization in that movie. I think that it's like a tight and suspenseful spy movie, and is kind of everything good. It's also my favorite Hitchcock movie.
I think this might be either my first or second favorite Hitchcock. It always battles with North by Northwest for me, which is another spy one. But Notorious is maybe the one I reach to more often. It's such a good looking film.
Yeah, and I'm just all about Ingrid Bergman, basically.
Oh yeah,
I know. She's fantastic in that film. And to be fair, the moody Cary Grant, I quite like that.
Yeah.
He's always like bouncy and happy in all the films I've seen him, except for that. Now, before we started recording, you did mention that you had a worst spy movie, a most disliked spy movie, and I'm very curious to know what that is.
Okay, so I will say that I'm not necessarily saying this is the worst spy movie, because I definitely have not completed an exhaustive watch of the genre. But
you haven't watched Ballistic X versus Sever yet?
No. But I don't know if either of you saw the recent sci-fi movie, The 355, but is that bad? But it was so funny, though.
Yep.
So it was one of those things where it was like, my friends and I were like, we haven't seen a movie since the before times. Let's go see something. And there were like two options. My friend said, this one looks like it should be fun. And I looked up the reviews and I said, everyone says this movie is terrible. And she said, let's go see it anyway. There was only 3 of us in the theater, and we just yelled at the screen the entire time. And it was amazing. Mainly, oh my gosh, the idea that they're like on the run from all of these international forces, and somehow we're finding people to like give them expensive outfits and do their hair and makeup, like, and they didn't have time to, they also didn't show where they found time and places to charge their phones, and also how they were carrying around their phones that their families had their numbers to. They're supposed to be spies that like their agencies are tracking, and they weren't like switching up their devices. There's so many problems. I can't even. It was the worst.
Yeah, that's the episode we did last week. Is that correct, Scott?
Okay.
Yeah, literally last week, in terms of release date anyway.
Okay.
Exactly last week, yeah.
So you loved it.
Yeah, best movie ever. It's great. We put it on its own list. It's so good. No, 355 is one of those films that if you pull at the thread a little bit, the whole tapestry unravels, and it just, it's a mess. It's a mess.
Yeah.
So that is your most disliked then. Maybe not hated, but disliked.
Yeah. Like I would say that it is a good movie to hate watch, because it's entertainingly bad.
I hated myself after I watched it, so I guess that's the same thing. Well, I mean, to be fair, you love Notorious and you dislike the 355. I couldn't ask for a better guest. So Cam, what are we talking about?
Yeah, we are tackling the 2017 live-action remake of Ghost in the Shell, starring Scarlett Johansson.
There's a lot to tackle with this film.
Mm-hmm.
A lot to talk about. So I think let's do the Letterboxd.com synopsis first. Oh my god, there's a more button. This is going to be very long.
Oh, wow.
Oh, good grief.
Deep breath, Scott. Deep breath.
Settle in. Settle in. Right. Ghost in the Shell. There's nothing sadder than a puppet without a ghost. In the near future, Major Scarlett Johansson is the first of her kind, a human saved from a terrible crash who is cyber-enhanced to be a perfect soldier devoted to stopping the world's most dangerous criminals. You'd end it there, really. But anyway, when terrorism reaches a new level that includes the ability to hack into people's minds and control them, Major is uniquely qualified to stop it. As she prepares to face a new enemy, Major discovers that she has been lied to. Her life was not saved, it was stolen. She will stop at nothing to recover her past, find out who did this to her, and stop them before they can do it to others. Based on the internationally acclaimed Japanese manga, The Ghost in the Shell.
Wow. That is definitely the longest letterbox synopsis you've ever read. And I think it's weird they have the tagline about the puppet when the whole Puppet Master element is not in the live action remake.
Mm-hmm. Longest and least informative.
Yeah, accurate, yeah.
What a waste that was. What a waste of everyone's time. I'm sorry, listeners, you had to hear that. So, this movie had a stink for many reasons. I never saw it in theaters, but I love, and you guys know when you listen to the original episode, listeners, I love the original. Anime, I could watch it any day. It's great. I didn't go and see this one. One, I wasn't a big fan of the casting, and I think we'll dig into that. And two, I'm done with these reboots. And even in 2017, I was done with these reboots. But I'm interested to hear, like, Jarrah, had you seen this in theaters? Did you pay any attention when it came out?
No, I had also not seen the original. So what I did was I watched this first, so that I was like going into it with a perspective of not immediately comparing it to the original.
Mm-hmm.
I was aware of like the original's impact on sci-fi in general, but and then I went and watched the original, and then I found even more things that I didn't like about it. But yeah, I mean, I would say first impression was that it is I've maybe only seen one or two other movies in my life that were so beautiful and incredibly unmoving.
Let's put a pin in that, because I want to come back to that exact thought. But I feel like Cam may have actually seen this in theaters and might be the rare occurrence in the team here.
Yes, I recall going to see this in theaters. It must have been a very sleepy day, because this was a movie that, as you said, Scott, it kind of arrived with like a stink. It was not screened for critics, which I remember, was fairly noteworthy, with a major expensive release starring Scarlett Johansson. And I remember going with my sister. I don't know why. It might have been a cheap Tuesday and we had nothing going on. And we went just to the local theater by my house, where I would often go and see, kind of like your Liam Neeson action movies and stuff like that on a sleepy day. And my memory was just kind of walking out and really like shrugging with a sense of like, yep, that was 2 hours in a movie theater. Had some nice visuals. Didn't really carry a lot with me. And I think at the time too, it had been a handful of years between when I saw the anime and I saw the live action remake. So like, I wasn't sitting there through the live action version going, oh, they botched that part. Oh, they screwed that up. I was more sitting there going, was that in the anime? Maybe it was. Maybe I'm just not remembering. So I didn't have that kind of like angry fan reaction. It was more of a meh kind of reaction.
That I think that carried through to a lot of the reviews that did come out after this film anyway. But Jarrah, I mentioned it because Cam saw it at the time. I was aware the film had come out at the time, but didn't see it for a couple of reasons I mentioned. Were you aware of sort of the
yes,
the
media
controversy? The controversy surrounding it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I've been really engaged in kind of the feminist fan blogosphere for several years. So I was definitely aware of the controversy of particularly casting Scarlett Johansson, although watching it, I was like, they actually cast a whole bunch of people as white that were not white in the original. They added some original characters, some of which I thought were interesting. But yeah, I mean, that was probably part of the reason I didn't go see it, was that to me that there wasn't a lot of justification for that casting. And I would stand by that. I think that it is kind of gross to take the setting and the atmosphere, and like even add to it with things like the geisha bot, and then not cast actors from the culture that you're portraying, at least in your principal roles. So yeah, I think it was gross. I do think, like, I did read some of the response to it from some of the creators, and I think there are potentially some interesting questions that you could go into around like the way that white beauty standards are idealized in parts of Asia, but they like 100% did not go there. And so I don't think that that's really like a good, a good explanation for it.
I was going to bring this up later in sort of the discussion after we'd sort of spoken about our review of the film, but we're kind of here. I think maybe it's just a natural point to talk about it. And I read some of the notes from the original creator of the anime saying he was fine with it. He gave his blessing to Scarlett Johansson. And I get that sort of the story approach, whereas, a shell can be anything and your ghost is your person. I totally get that point. I just question why you would invite this criticism in the first place. Not only should you be casting people that are appropriate, but why would you go to the lengths of making it such a problematic casting? I know getting Scarlett Johansson, putting that name on a poster is going to bring people into the theaters. Well, we don't know about the box office yet, Cam. Maybe it didn't. But I don't know. I just feel like it's such a misstep before you've even got your film out.
Yeah, I also, I read, I think it was maybe one of the original voice actors' commentaries, like, oh, well, it was an American movie, so we assumed that the people were going to be played by Americans. But then, like, they didn't transpose the setting. So, like, if they were going to make the whole thing set in, like, future New York or future San Francisco or something, then it would be... I still probably would have some issues with it, but I think it would be a little less questionable. But like I said, when you're taking the setting and the atmosphere and like many of the names kind of whole cloth from the original, but you're just substituting actors of a different race, then that's cringy.
No, it really is. I mean, it is a tricky one, isn't it? We've had a couple of films quite early on in our run where like it should have been cast as, I think it was Remo Williams from the 80s, and there's a character that's meant to be like Chinese descent, and they had Joel Grey, American actor Joel Grey, in yellowface, and you just think,
oh dear, yep.
Why? There's hundreds of great actors you could have picked, and you chose Joel Grey. I don't know. But this is 2017. It's not like it's 1982, where maybe some people would sort of shrug their shoulders at it.
And like, this is the classic argument, too, that Hollywood would make at the time of like, well, we wanted a movie star. And their argument was always, well, there's no, big Asian stars we could put in this. There's no Japanese actors we could put as the front line. But the point was they never created those stars. And suddenly, like, you get a movie, say, like Crazy Rich Asians from a couple years ago, and suddenly they go, oh, this makes money. And suddenly you have things like Shang-Chi. The point was they were never willing to gamble on it. They would always say, well, those stars don't exist, ergo Scarlett Johansson has to play this role. That's kind of the way they would always defend it. And I often feel like when you get cases of people even associated with the original saying, well, we were okay with it, I think it's because they also are just like, well, that's the way Hollywood works. Like, what do we possibly say? This is the way this industry has run for, like decades upon decades upon decades.
I mean, it's not something we're going to solve in this podcast, of course, but I do think it bears acknowledgement, especially in this early stage, that the film was setting itself up for a bit of a disaster. So I think that probably leads us in beautifully to the behind-the-scenes cam. What do you have for us?
Well, I was going to say just quickly, like, I feel like this was one of the last big movies to, like, whitewash Asian characters because there was so much controversy. And I'm sure there's going to be examples in the future that are also problematic for, various other reasons. But I feel like there was a number of kind of hits that Hollywood took, because you had that Last Airbender, and then you had Ghost in the Shell, and they were very noisy in terms of the criticism they received, to the point where I would be curious if a studio would be even willing to gamble at that now. Like, I think they would just know that they're going to get, a lot of criticism for it. We'll see.
I mean, you had Benedict Cumberbatch's Khan since then.
That was before, wasn't it? That's 2013. Yeah.
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah. So, yeah, but it was all part of that big era. And I think that there had to be a lot of backlash before people thought, like, maybe actually this will hurt our bottom line.
And that's the real tragedy in a sense as well. It's not that they've learned a lesson and go, oh, we should be spotlighting these fantastic actors from other places that aren't America. It's that, the fan reaction will hurt the box office, so we shouldn't do this.
Well, never expect morality from Hollywood. It's based entirely on business. If they can make money, then they will, convey those positive messages if people are willing to pay to hear those positive messages. You know what I mean? Like, it's driven entirely by, for example, Wonder Woman's a huge hit, and they go, oh, cool, make a lot of female-driven action movies. And it's because they were making money. It's not because Hollywood was like, we've got to do the right thing. We have to have equal representation in our movies. It's because there's an audience for it. And we've seen the same thing, as I mentioned, Crazy Rich Asians, Black Panther. That diversity should have always been there, but Hollywood doesn't tend to bend to it until they suddenly have a financial incentive to really do it.
You got me thinking about if this was the last one, where maybe they really did learn their lesson, at least in terms of the money side of things.
Well, never say never. We'll see.
We'll see.
Yeah.
Well, I did cue you up before, Cam, but what do you have for us?
This was based on the anime, which was created by Shiro Masamune, and the movie was directed by Mamoru Oshii. But in 2008, Variety announced that DreamWorks was planning to make a 3D live-action feature based on Ghost in the Shell. Apparently, DreamWorks had released Ghost in the Shell 2 in the US in 2004, and Spielberg had become enamored with the property. He had a quote. He said, "Ghost in the Shell is one of my favorite stories. It's a genre that has arrived, and we enthusiastically welcome it to DreamWorks."
That's the most, corporate statement I've ever heard in my life. It was written by AI.
The most impressive thing to me about it is that it's 2008, and they're going after the rights. I would have thought those rights would have been snapped up right after The Matrix comes out in 1999.
I'm trying to think when Innocence came out now, Ghost in the Shell 2.
2004.
So that's not even that close. That's strange.
Yeah. Yeah. So they brought on a writer, Jamie Moss, who'd started out as an actor with bit parts and things like Life or Something Like It and Catch Me If You Can. And he had written the movie Street Kings, which was kind of a popular kind of gritty cop drama. And so he went right from Street Kings into this. And he developed that for about a year. And then they brought in Leda Kalogridis, who had written Shutter Island. She got this gig before Shutter Island had even come out. And she would go on to do a number of things, including she was one of the many writers on Terminator Genesis. She did Battle Angel Alita. So she's someone who they obviously looked at a lot for sci-fi concepts being brought to the screen. And she worked on it for a while until all went quiet for about 5 years. And then in 2014, they hired Rupert Sanders, the British director who had done Snow White and the Huntsman. That was his big breakthrough. Previous to that, he had done mostly music videos and shorts. And Snow White and the Huntsman, I don't know if you recall, there was quite a bit of controversy around that. Yeah.
I don't remember the controversy. I just remember it was bad.
Yeah, that's all I remember as well. It's like a whiff of a film.
Well, I find it interesting that he has two movies, Snow White and the Huntsman and then Ghost in the Shell. And both were surrounded by controversy for different reasons. We don't usually comment too much on personal lives, but Snow White and the Huntsman was where he'd had an affair with star Kristen Stewart during production, and it really became very noisy. It overshadowed the entire release of the movie, and I remember being a bit surprised that that he was being hired to do another big budget movie, because often, it's your debut and there's a lot of noise around you. It kind of can affect your job, but nonetheless, yeah. He was hired in 2014 to make the film. And really, since this, he has only done an episode of the TV show Foundation. And he's been attached to the Crow reboot. But I think everyone in Hollywood has been attached to the Crow reboot. It's been in development for 15 years.
I'm currently workshopping it now.
Scott, you are now attached to do the Crow reboot. That's why you're wearing the makeup.
That's exactly. I do find that first bit of controversy surprising. It doesn't. I mean, obviously, it's personal life stuff, so I don't really want to dig into it. But it's just...
Yeah.
Why was that in the news? Why was that? Because of Kristen Stewart, right? Is that the reason why it was big news?
That was part of it. And to the best of my memory, I believe he was, married at the time. So it was, again, it was very, tabloid kind of stuff spilling over. But it became what the big conversations points were as that movie was being released. So, yeah.
Okay. Well... He got another film, at least.
That's right. So, the movie apparently went through several writers up until this point. I couldn't even find the names. There was apparently so many. There was like, I think 6 or 7 people had been working on Ghost in the Shell. And around the point that Rupert Sanders signs on, they're looking at Margot Robbie to star in it, but she bailed to do Suicide Squad instead, which worked out pretty well actually for her.
That's the catalyst that launched her career. I would say that's the big role.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Also, they were looking at a, Western actor day one then.
Yeah, they were.
Okay.
Yep. And so Scarlett Johansson was confirmed shortly after Margot Robbie passed. And she said what drew her in was she was very excited at the prospect of a female-driven action film, especially one with a big fan base. So,
in terms of a role with depth, Major Motoko is fantastic. A lot of actors would be chomping at the bit to play that character, so I completely get her passion for it, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. And so they brought in yet another writer, William Wheeler, who'd worked mostly in TV doing episodes of like Empire and The Cape. He'd also written Mira Nair's 2012 film The Reluctant Fundamentalist, as well as Queen of Katwe, the Disney film starring Lupita Nyong'o. And he jumped right from Katwe into Ghost in the Shell and developed it over about a year and a half. And he said when he left, he said, "I don't know completely where they landed quite yet."
That sounds like they took his notes and
That tracks.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, a year and a half as well to be developing a script. That's a long time. Considering some of the screenwriters we've spoken to on the show have cracked out a movie in 6 months, you just think, wow, this has been gestating since 2008. So I guess, yeah, all right, that makes sense.
With up to about 8 writers at this point.
That also explains the 5 production companies at the start.
Mm-hmm. But they decided to roll their dice on a 9th writer. They went to Jonathan Herman, who had co-written Straight Outta Compton, and he was brought in to overhaul the script. And then they went to another writer after him, which was Aaron Kruger, who'd gotten his start in 1999 on Arlington Road, but he'd gone on to do stuff like Scream 3, The Ring, the second and third Transformers films, Dumbo, the remake, as well as Top Gun 2, now in theaters.
Oh, okay. One big hit there, at least.
He's a big studio guy. He works on a lot of stuff. But
okay.
the final credits, the way it worked out was that Jamie Moss, the originator, working on the project, got a credit. William Wheeler, who worked on it for a year and a half, got a credit. And then Aaron Kruger got a credit.
It's a lot of credits.
Mm-hmm.
Should I start singing Too Many Cooks in the background as you keep talking?
Yeah, no kidding. And just in terms of casting, talked about Johansson, but there was a note just about Takeshi Kitano, who was a very celebrated director and actor. And this was his first English language film since 1995 when he crossed the pond to make Johnny Mnemonic. He has not come back since.
This makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Isn't that a spy film, actually?
Nah, it's one of those like cyberpunk films. So
it always gets thrown around as one of Keanu's worst roles, or like at least a funny one to look at.
I saw it once. I did not laugh. That is my memory.
I'm not sure it was angled as a comedy, Cam.
Well, it did not play as an unintentional one either. So.
Right.
As we said, this movie was released with a lot of controversy around it. It had a budget of $110 million. Domestically, it did 40.6. International, 129.3, for a worldwide total of 169.9. So they didn't probably even cover their marketing costs on this one.
Swing and a miss, that one. Although, to be fair, the original Ghost in the Shell also made no money.
Well, in theaters, but it did on home video. It was mostly a home video release.
Which you can't rely on anymore.
Exactly, yeah.
According to Matt Damon, anyway.
That's right. It landed at number 56 for the year at the worldwide box office, right between John Wick Chapter 2 and 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri.
Okay.
I know, that's a weird grouping there.
Yep. I would imagine that 3 Billboards cost less to make.
As did John Wick, Chapter
Mhm.
2 as well. Yeah.
I suppose I've seen John Wick Chapter 2. I've never seen Three Billboards. Is it a good film?
I also have not seen it, but it is based on a play, and it's set in America, not in a dystopian future, I believe. So, guessing it was cheaper.
It's an interesting film in that it was quite polarizing. Frances McDormand won an Oscar for Best Actress, that year at the Oscars for it. It was nominated for Best Picture, Director, Screenplay, various other things, but I enjoyed it at the time. I'd be very curious if I revisited if I would feel the same way. It was one that felt like it was on the cusp of being #problematic, even more so than it was, and I think there's a reason you don't hear it mentioned as much anymore. I think it was one critics really got on board with, in 2017. I don't know that they would do the same thing now.
Well, it seems to be the topic and the theme of this week's episode. So, things not to talk about now. But anything else for us, Cam?
Yeah, just the top 3 for that year. Number 1 was Star Wars Episode 8. Number 2 is Beauty and the Beast, the live-action remake. And number 3 was The Fate of the Furious.
Franchises.
Mm-hmm.
What the state of Hollywood, eh? How fun. To be fair, this is also a franchise.
That's also true.
And John Wick is a franchise.
And we cover a lot of franchises on this podcast. Careful, Scott.
We love franchises.
And you think you liked 3 Billboards Outside of Ebbing, Missouri. Just wait until you see 4 Billboards, the sequel.
That's right.
Oh, no. Well, I think we've arrived at our destination. It's time to talk about this film and initiate the hack. Jarrah, you're our guest. You always go first. You've watched this film and you watched the original, which I want to sort of talk to you about a little bit as well. But what did you think of Ghost in the Shell 2017?
Yeah, well, like I said, overall, I think it was gorgeous but soulless. It basically it had no ghost itself. It was all shell. I think
I like that line.
that I reckon like immediately I was drawn in by like colors and the the setting of the scenes and the visuals, but I hoped that I would find more, that I would feel like emotionally drawn to the characters, and I wasn't really, to mostly anyone. I will say that I think Juliette Binoche was one of the better parts of the movie, and I think that adding that character was not necessarily a terrible idea, as Dr. Oulé. But like she was the only one that I felt like emotionally drawn to in any way. Maybe the mom that shows up and makes tea, but she's not really around for long enough for you to really, really care about. I think the other thing that I thought was that the political dynamics were overly simplistic and to the point of being naive. The idea that you would have, their Section 9 fighting this essentially like robotics company that was working to some degree with the government, but that the government would ultimately side with Section 9 and like by extension side with the people against the corporation. I was like, no, I don't buy it would be that easy. I don't think they were presenting it in quite that black and white of a way, but it seemed like they just made the story overly simplistic. So those are just like some of the kind of high level pieces. The other thing I thought was that the music let it down. I think that the soundtrack was trying to be kind of like electronic and futuristic, but it again, like it's possible to make powerful electronic music, but this was not it. It just felt kind of like dry, and it was just there, I guess.
Yeah, I definitely got that vibe as well. It felt almost just like generic sci-fi wallpaper score, where if you're going to really swing with your visuals, at least try to do something interesting with the music.
Yeah.
And they keep using like little clips of the original score, which was phenomenal. Still a score I'll go and listen to. But like, why would you tease with a much better score? Like, do something. Either don't mention the good one and just do your own thing, or just use the old one because the old one worked just fine.
Yeah, like a new orchestration of the original score would have worked. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Cam, what about you?
I found this movie to be kind of the word I underlined was sludgy when I was watching it, where I admire a lot of the visuals of the movie. I'm not sure. I remember at the time they were really selling this as like Rupert Sanders, the visionary director, which was a popular term they would throw around for people back, a few years ago. They'd be like, "Ah, yes, Zack Snyder, the great visionary director," and they would attach that to any kind of up-and-coming director who made things that didn't look like cardboard. If they were at least
just wait until you see my The Crow movie.
Visionary director Scott Hardy. Yeah, so like it felt a little bit Blade Runner-esque, but it felt like it was very busy. It felt like he had invested a lot of time into developing the visual world of Ghost in the Shell. And I think it's sometimes hard to translate, animation to live action. I thought they did a pretty good job of walking that line. But like this movie has no pulse. I mean, never mind, as Jarrah said, a ghost. It has no pulse either. Where the mystery of it, I feel like they were trying to simplify it for North American audiences because the original can get quite complex. But I wouldn't say that they made it less confusing. I think they actually made it more confusing in ways where I really was struggling to understand at points like why they were doing what they were doing. I didn't really understand what Kuze was even up to because in the original, it's very clear what's going on with the puppet master. Whereas here, they made it kind of vague. And yes, you have a big reveal of what it all means, but they also kind of remove any of the questions. The original has so much in terms of philosophy and just sci-fi questions you can kind of leave the movie with. Whereas here, I'm like, well, it felt like they kind of stripped a lot of that out, mostly to probably make an action film that would please, like a Friday night crowd. But also, like, it almost felt like it was like a springboard for what could be like a action franchise. Like they were almost taking cues from like superhero movies or something at the end when she's doing the Invisi-suit and jumping off the building. So yeah, just like one of those movies where I'm like, there's elements here I like. I can understand why Scarlett Johansson made this movie. It feels kind of like a mainstream version of what she was almost trying to do in Under the Skin, which was a much, much, much better sci-fi movie. But overall, I just walked away kind of shrugging my shoulders once again.
It's interesting. I think all three of us, because I'll chuck my 2 cents in, have come up with oversimplified. I wrote down lacked depth, serviceable, words I circled. But I went back and I was thinking about the original film, and there's a quote that sticks in my head. It's one of my favorite quotes in the film, so I'm going to bastardize it slightly. I think it's simple. Oversimplify, and you breed in weakness. It's slow death. Very slow in this case, because boy, did I have trouble watching this film. I don't think it helps that I'm a massive fan of the original, and so I'm constantly going, well, I wouldn't have done this. I wouldn't have done that. Why have you changed this? Why have you changed that? I think if you meet the film on its own terms, maybe it's a different experience, and I did try to do that on the second viewing, which bumped it up a little bit for me. And there's bits I did enjoy here, but I just go back to questioning, like you both said, why would you simplify it and yet make it muddier at the same time? Making it more like a origin story for the Major, stripping her of her identity in a sense, could be a really interesting concept. But instead you're just left wondering what's going on. And it doesn't help that much like the Puppet Master is a very simple concept, with a lot of depth to it. This chap who I forget the name of now, Cam, what's the villain's name?
Kuze.
Thank you, Kuze, or who I refer to as Max Headroom in my notes. I don't know what he wanted really. I don't know what he was doing, and I didn't really feel any threat from him. And not to mention, the original version is 90 minutes long. This is an hour and 50 minutes long. And I spent more time with Bateau, it felt like, in the original than I did this. I had no idea who anyone else was. It's only because I knew the characters that I could sort of imprint my thoughts on them. But really, it pays no mind to anyone. You have no idea what the constitution of Section 9 is. And I think it's you had more runtime and you said less? What's up with that?
Yep. I think you also have like less sense of her position within the hierarchy and her like her beliefs outside of this specific mission. Um, but like, yeah, if you had asked me what is the point of this movie not having, or like what are the messages you're supposed to take away from this movie, I guess I would say corporations want to turn us into robots and we shouldn't let them, and that people need to know where they're from. And those are clearly not like the main takeaways from the original, which I think are way more interesting.
Like you could write novels, you could write textbooks about some of the theories and the concepts in the original Ghost in the Shell. I'm not sure I could write a pamphlet about the theories in this film.
No, that's an excellent point. And, you were talking about Kuze and like how murky kind of the mystery is, because that's the driving force of what at least the first chunk of the movie is about. And they don't do a very good job establishing like why an audience should care. Forget us. Jarrah, you hadn't seen, Ghost in the Shell 95 beforehand, but like you did afterwards, and you can now talk about it in that regard. Imagine you'd never seen the 95 one. You just go and see this. I think you'd like walk away. Your experience would be like, I don't really know what was going on. Like, I think like in many ways you almost have to have seen the 95 one, which definitely was not the goal of this movie. Like, they wanted this to be a big budget mainstream movie.
I did definitely have to look up like a Wikipedia article about what the plot of the movie was while I was watching the movie to try to figure out what I was supposed to be seeing.
Yeah.
I was unfortunately reminded of a film that we've been sort of recalling back to recently, especially with 355 last week, which is Salt, with Angelina Jolie. That can't define the constitution of your lead, and so if you're asking people to come back for a sequel, or you're setting up some sort of cinematic universe, then why would I go back to see the sequel? I do not know who the Major is by the end of this film, except that is it supposed to be, I'm just going to ask this question now, is it supposed to be setting up the anime at the end of this film? Because it has the same shot at the end where she's jumping off. And she knows her name, it's Major Motoko. You can go for the kill. And
like, do you mean were they trying to set up a sequel that would have been more the plot of like with the puppet master and stuff?
Yeah, like I feel like they were evoking that first shot. Well, not the opening credits, but the first shot of the anime at the end of this film.
But they do use it at the beginning, sort of as well, when
Yeah.
she goes into the dinner party through the window in this case, or like the wall or something, and then attacks the geisha bot. And like honestly, the moments that they like directly lifted from the original were like the moments that I had written down. Like, that was a cool moment.
The stealth fight in the water.
Yeah.
With the exact same backdrop of those sort of apartment blocks. That still looks fantastic.
Yeah.
But you just go, well, you just lifted that from an anime. But then The Matrix did the same thing, and we all clap when we watch the Matrix. So that's not a bad thing necessarily.
I think that final shot really was owing a lot to that whole era of superhero movies where they ended with like, Spider-Man swinging at the camera, or Batman jumping off a building, Iron Man flying around. It was like they wanted their big impact hero shot, and they probably sat down and they're like, what's the most iconic thing about this character? It's this scene that they have, pretty much recreated at the start of the movie, which is her jumping off the building, doing the dive in that suit. And I think they were like, that's our button at the end as well.
I think the thing about her going back and living with her mom is super weird on a number of levels. I mean, first of all, I thought it was really weird if there was like this big conspiracy with all of these experiments happening that they like left living relatives around. First of all, that was odd. Because they just randomly killed a lot of other people. And then that she could just like go pick up like a normal domestic life with her mom was very odd.
That's the sequel I want to see. Like, she's making pancakes and breaks the frying pan because she's too strong or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like explaining to her mom what happened. This has been quite a journey she's been on.
Yeah, like the end of the original, they want to unsettle you. The end of this, they want to settle you. Like, they show that she has a happy ending, essentially. Like, I mean, I know there may be being like, but also robotics are scary, but they don't put her on a kid body.
That's also true. That would have been amazing if they had.
Yeah.
Well, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the things that we liked. I think that's important to acknowledge that films are hard to make and there are good things in everything. So, Jarrett, you first give us something that you liked.
Yeah, well, like I said, I like Juliette Binoche. I think that having a character that cared about her and saw her as a human even when she wasn't sure she was human was one of the more successful elements of the film, and actually something that I don't think hurt the original narrative by adding it. Um, I think in the original, like Bateau kind of fills a bit of that role by like always treating her like she's an equal. Um, in this case, I think that they maybe split that up kind of. So I like that, and then like the fact that she's in a complicated position because she also was performing these experiments. But I think she had a more interesting arc than most people in that movie, and that it was generally a successful ad.
I thought that character worked quite well too, the Juliette Binoche character, where it at least gave kind of a human voice to like the creation process of that character and someone you could actually have that dialogue with, but it didn't feel like forced. Like sometimes you get the real exposition characters thrown in there. This one I bought the relationship between the two characters and they had just enough material together that I actually cared about it. So in terms of like injecting a new character, sometimes that can go really wrong, but I thought here I agree with you, Jarrah. Like it actually worked for me.
Yeah, I totally agree too. I think if you're having like a look at what this major is comprised of, and you're talking about like the creation of her, I don't think it's ever spoken about in the 95 version that this is Motoko's first mission, but this is like the birth of this version of the major. So of course you would have a maternal figure to guide her through this process, and I love that, and I think that's a really important thing. It's a shame that she gets offed at the like hour and 10-minute mark, but I guess then the baton, pardon the pun, is passed on to her real mother, in a sense. Maybe not successfully, but I think that's a great addition, and I like the moments that they spend together in the film.
Mm-hmm.
Cal, what about you? Something you liked?
So I think for me, it's hard to like point to a lot of elements and say I really liked them because it was more like which ones didn't bother me. But I will say in terms of like some of the world building, I thought it was fairly interesting to me. I liked sequences like right off the bat, the whole sequence of her being born, essentially like taking her first breaths and everything, I thought was really well done. Like if you're going to try to connect an audience to this source material, an audience that has never been through it, I thought that was a very smart way to do it, to show your character actually being born in that way and making kind of the impact of those first breaths really count. I thought that stuff was set up well. I liked bits like when we go to that scene, right off the bat where you're going in and they've got like the geisha bots. I mean, that is a crazy design and it's really eye-catching. There's a reason they work those into every trailer. And I don't understand why Michael Wincott was there for 3 seconds, but I always appreciate seeing Michael Wincott. That's just a tick in the plus column for me, just in general. But yeah, it was those kind of visuals, and even just like the streets, the big neon characters, the sort of thing we would see continued on in like the second Blade Runner film and many other things. But I thought here there was like a sense of kind of like that overwhelming cityscape that really worked well for that character.
Especially some of the low down shots where she's traveling around with Bateau, feeding the dogs, and
yeah,
it's like everything's closing in on them. There's no room to breathe in this city. And I agree. I think that's a success, and like the visuals of the geisha bot is great. I think a lot of that was actually real as well, not CG. Tip my hat to that. Good stuff.
I don't understand though why the geisha bot starts screaming at one point, like opens up its face to be really terrifying looking.
Yeah. I think if you start again pulling the threads of this film, it will fall apart. But on the surface, I think it looks great. I agree.
And I think in terms of showcasing a lot of the cybernetic elements that various characters have, they did a really good job of making it seem alternately cool, but also kind of touching into some almost like Cronenbergian body horror or something, where there's elements where you kind of go like, oh, like when the woman's eyes flip up and she has like the binoculars.
Yeah, that was cool.
Show up. Or like the fast moving fingers that were, in the original, but you see them actually done in live action. And it's like, oh, that kind of gives you like a shudder, but at the same time, you kind of admire how cool the design looks.
Actually, you mentioned the body horror side of things. I actually made a note about it, and a lovely Star Trek connection having Jarrah here as well. Is it reminds me of the Borg, especially there's that sequence where they're in that where they've like kidnapped people and they're experimenting on them and basically assimilating them into like a collective. It reminded me a lot of like the Dark Frontier two-parter from Voyager, where you get the real sense of horror of assimilation. I got flashbacks to that, so that was quite cool to see.
Yeah, for sure, I can see that.
And I like the bit where they had the major captive and like pulled the the piece off her face.
Yeah.
Like moments like that were really effective.
Like if you're gonna do something like this, make it visceral. I agree.
Yeah, and like the part, her arms ripping off, that like worked really well in that version as well.
I didn't think they'd do that. When I saw her jump on the tank, I thought, because that's got to look pretty gruesome in real life, and they actually really lean into it.
They only had her lose one arm, but yes.
Yeah. You see like her back like spread out and rip apart as well. Yep. That's really gross.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that last bit's a bit of a CG mess, but that bit looked cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I just want to shout out to Scarlett Johansson, actually. Problematic casting to aside, I think she does a good job with the material she's given. I think even to the point where a lot of the sequences she doesn't blink.
Right.
Much like the Major in the original. She has obviously studied the original and is trying her best to do this. And she's able to deliver a lot of emotion while being emotionless, which, again, another Star Trek connection, Brent Spiner does so well in The Next Generation. I think Scarlett Johansson does a fantastic job as the Major.
This one's so tough, right? Because it's like she never should have gotten the job or taken the job. But can you say like she delivers on the concept of the Major? I think she does. Like I think she gets across quite a bit in the same way she did in Under the Skin, which is sort of like this someone existing within a body that's not theirs. Like I think that aspect really does come across quite well.
I think like she delivers on seeming kind of like the animated Major in terms of like her vocal patterns and things, which are generally kind of flat and kind of like flat demeanor, which I assume she's trying to show like there's a lot of stuff happening internally, but it's not on her face. But I don't know, when I was watching it, having not seen the original, I definitely was thinking about like Voyager 7 of 9 and how like I wanted to see more inner turmoil, especially by the part where she starts, because pretty early on she starts realizing she doesn't know everything. And I wanted to see that like more of that war actually playing out in her face and her voice.
I think you're given like more in the original anime of just Motoko talking through how she's experiencing things, and you're especially that moment, the scene on the boat is the one I always go back to where she's talking with Bateau, and they try and do that in this film, and it's nowhere near as emotional or impactful. It's more just a tossed off 5-minute scene.
Yeah, they really stripped that scene down to nothing, really, because in the original, it's her underwater talking about how like she experiences like hope, like there's some optimism to that experience she has, and in the new version, it's just kind of like very emo.
Because it's meant to mirror like her being birthed at the start and underwater. Because they even do the reflection in this film; they do that double reflection thing. But yeah, it's lip service, unfortunately. Which I think probably brings us over to the dislike column, unless anyone else have any likes left.
No.
Nope. Right, straight on over to dislikes. Jarrah, go for it.
Well, one thing I haven't mentioned that I really noticed upon watching the original is that the new one really lacks scenes of everyday life. So the original has a lot of scenes in between the key scenes that just set the atmosphere by showing like people at the market, people waiting for the train. And in this universe, I was thinking, like if I had to explain how a day worked in this world, it was like everyone was either part of these groups or like elite hackers or super wealthy, like teched out people, or they were living in slums and were anarchists. And like Tea Lady seemed to come out of nowhere because you never saw that there were like random middle class people that were like had not too many modifications. And you miss out on that scene that's in the original where she talks to the guy that is a part of their group that has minimal mods and says, you're important because if you cited this scene, if we're too familiar, then uniformity breeds death. So you miss out on like all of the fuzzy middle in this movie, I think. So that was one thing I didn't love.
There's like a scene where she goes to meet, I think she's a sex worker, I believe. That's the implication.
I got the same sense, yeah.
Sure. Apparently there's a longer version of the scene that was cut in post where they actually kiss, which I don't think was necessary. But that's meant to be the Major exploring her humanity. That's how I read that scene. But I don't want to say lip service, that's a pun. But, it's just a veneer. I don't think it really digs beneath the surface on that.
It felt like a moment that in isolation, the filmmakers go, look, we're doing some like real sci-fi here, but it's kind of cut down so like into such a small scene and then buried in this movie that's like a lot of action. It's very like overwhelmed by its visuals. So I feel like that scene doesn't really like jump out the way it should. Like that should be like a real showcase moment for the character, but it kind of, you kind of don't remember it by the time the movie's over.
I knew because I wrote it down. I don't remember the scene particularly well, and I saw it on the IMDb trivia about the extended version. But
I honestly don't even know what scene you mean.
Yeah.
Wow, there you go. That says it all. Cam, a dislike for us.
The villain, Kuze. Well, he's not the villain, but like Kuze, his like motivation is pretty much non-existent off the top of the movie, and when he does finally show up, we get Michael Pitt, who I've liked in some things and not really cared about in others, because he was it Scott Criminal? The other
I was just checking what he was in. I think it is Criminal. I'm just
he was like a hacker in that. Wasn't he like a mysterious hacker they were like tracking through the movie?
The Dutchman.
Why is Michael Pitt the person that's like mysterious that our main characters are hunting throughout like the first sections of a movie?
I mean, I wish he had that robo body in Criminal. That would have made that film a lot better.
You look at the original and what the Puppet Master ultimately meant, which was like merging with her to create this new, entity going forward. Whereas here, like, we finally get together with him. He's one of those characters that's very underwritten, and we just find out that like they hung out together in like a anti-augmentation group or something like that. Like they were protesters together and got captured and turned into these augments. And the final moment is after they're both like dying, they don't join. He's just like, well, see you later. And then a sniper kills him and you're like, okay, well, I guess that's sad, I guess.
Her reaction means it's sad, of course.
Sure, but
not earned.
They just do nothing with that character. Like, yeah, you didn't do anything. If you're going to build up a character like that, you have to, I think the audience has to understand by the time that character shows up why they're important. Like what this means and what it means to our main character. And I don't think they communicate that well at all.
What was his mission?
I thought that he was seeking revenge on the people that experimented on him because he was killing all the scientists, and that he wanted to like meet her to decide whether like she was also someone, how he felt about her, because like, we're essentially the same and you could either be on my side or you can be on their side. But I agree that it like wasn't super compelling. And
he also like had a lot of resentment because he and several others had been like the failed experiments, but she was the successful one.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to level any sort of criticism of Michael Pitt. I think it's really just the story here that let him down. But then, the film has another major villain that's, I think, even worse. It's just corporation bad.
Right.
Oh, yeah. And the guy who was the face of the corporation, Cutter, was extremely non-intimidating.
He did get to play with the old Star Trek Picard, like hover handle thing. I found that funny. Apparently, they were doing that in 2017.
Mm-hmm. There's like a scene where he's like leaning across a table and like threatening Aramaki, and you're just like, yeah, I don't buy it at all.
I was waiting for him to just pull out his revolver and blow him away right back then. Like you knew he was the bad guy from the second you see it. You can read it. It's a shame, really, because two-dimensional. We'll go back to that. Simplistic. We'll go back to that word.
Cutter's the type of character who's very one-dimensional, but at least in a world of like, say, like the RoboCop movies or something, they would give their one-dimensional corporate guys like real personalities and cast them with actors who just have a weird, like, screen presence, so you'd remember them. But like Cutter, boy, like he is just kind of a blank slate. And you put him opposite, Aramaki, and Kitano is just such a screen presence, even though it feels like he's in a movie by himself a lot of this film. It feels like they were just kind of shooting scenes with him in isolation for most of this. But nonetheless, he is so much more screen presence, and just putting the two guys in a room together is just really unfair to the Cutter character.
I would not buy this film for $1.
Nice. I appreciate that.
I rented it for $3.99,
Oh,
but
no.
So did I.
$3.99 I'm never getting back.
The price you pay for being on Spy Hard's podcast, I can only apologize. We will not be refunding. No refunds.
It was cheaper than seeing the $3.55 in a theater, so
I paid to see it twice.
Oh, God. Oh, yeah, you did, yeah. Wow.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
Calling all agents. Independent podcasting, much like the spy game, requires considerable resources, whether it's research, equipment, hosting, or of course constructing a top secret volcano lair. We're putting out the call for your support.
That's right. As you may know, we've activated the Spy Hard's Patreon, home of our ever-growing lineup of Agents in the Field episodes where we decode non-spy films from your favorite spy actors and full film commentaries with more intel than a Basil exposition briefing.
Cam, what have we got in our crosshairs this month?
Well, how about some sci-fi of the George Lucas variety? Because we are going to tackle Attack of the Clones, the second in our ongoing prequel coverage.
Listen, you will.
And if that sounds delicious, then become a true Spy Hard today and join the circus at patreon.com/spyhards. But before this message self-destructs, Cam, resume the spy jinx. I just want to talk about the heavy-handedness of this film. Talk about like hand-holding you to your metaphor. Even at the beginning, they're like, "This is your shell, and you're a ghost." Because that's the title of the film. And you just think, oh, good grief. Let us like understand some subtext a little bit. Give us a chance. First 5 minutes, they've explained the whole idea, the whole concept, and at any chance they can, they will be like, well, yeah, you're ghosting. Oh, that's a shell right there. And they just will not let anything be subtle.
Yeah.
It's bludgeoning at some point. It's overpowering, and I think it's probably to do with the dialogue being reworked by 58 people.
Well, it's so often the case when they're like adapting something like this to the screen and they are insecure about getting it across, where it feels like that mix of on the nose and murky at the same time. It's always interesting when that happens, where you'll see a movie like that and you just sit there and go like, I can kind of track this, but at the same time it feels very confused. And I think the several army of writers obviously lends a bit of evidence as to why that might be the case. This movie was also produced by Avi Arad and Ari Arad, who worked on the Spider-Man franchise. They were doing the Amazing Spider-Man films at this time as well. And those were movies with a heavy amount of producer interference. I don't know that that's the case with Ghost in the Shell, but when I look at the storytelling in both those Spider-Man films and here, there's some similarities.
Because I mentioned earlier the 5 production companies involved in putting this film out.
The 17 minutes of production slates at the start of the film? Yeah.
Yeah, I was worried I was watching the wrong film for a while. What does that mean for the actual film? Because we see it a lot now with these sort of co-financed films. Do they have an influence on the final project, or is it just about the money?
It depends. I would guess most of that was just financing, where it was like no one wanted to foot the $110 million budget for this alone, so they kind of farmed it out to several corporations.
Okay. Now, I did have a question. It does fall in my sort of dislike category because it's about the film. I don't like it. We've all compared this to the original. Now, Jarrah, you watched this first and then the 1995 original. But you've seen both in sequential, the opposite sequential order, I suppose. But if you took that away, if you took the 1995 film away from the conversation for a second, does this film hold up at all?
I mean, my after I watched it, I thought, okay, cool. I can see some things here that influenced other sci-fi. Um, but overall, my main reaction was shrug. I don't really know that it holds up that much on its own. I think missing those really big important philosophical themes, which I think are the most interesting parts to explore, and that really like you can't ever conclude the debates around those. I feel like you can conclude, at least like you can get a reasonable consensus for like, yeah, we probably shouldn't be cyborgs, and at least not controlled by a corporation.
I wonder how much of that was also a sense of like they wanted this to be a franchise, and they're like kind of like with the Star Trek 2009 where they're like, okay, give the audience like a kind of an action film, and then next time we're going to get philosophical, which is something I remember them saying a lot in the press, which we can debate whether Into Darkness was philosophical really, but nonetheless I remember them saying that a lot on the press rounds. And I wonder if like that was the case here where they were like, give the audience like a sci-fi action movie, and next time we can really delve into the themes of this. I don't know. I would be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if they would be saying that back then.
It definitely felt like they were trying to make it more accessible, but like we've said, it didn't really work. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't think it really holds up. I think that if the first one hadn't existed and this was just like birthed independently, then the things that were groundbreaking about it would have previously happened in movies like The Matrix. And so you just think that it was rehashing those other things. And that other than, I mean, it kind of reminds me of, what was that movie, Valerian, and the one that's based on the French graphic novel?
Don't ask me to recite the whole title, but yes, Valerian.
In that it was like one of those things where it was like, there was a lot of effort put into this. It looked really good. No one ever talks about it anymore.
It's Valerian and the City of 1,000 Planets.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
I only know that because it's on our list to cover one day.
That's true. It does count as a spy movie. This
This
is also a film that I feel like it didn't impact people because they'd seen The Matrix, and also The Matrix, the second and third at this point. So like, unless this movie hits a home run at what it's doing, I don't think people care that much because it feels kind of samey. And this is also many years after the whole cyberpunk craze where you had a lot of movies that had a similar kind of vibe.
I wonder, like, well, actually, Jarrah, you're the correct person to ask. You saw this film. Did you immediately watch the 1995 version the same day, or was it like a couple of days later?
It was a couple of days later.
In that period in between the two, were you just dreading having this conversation with us because of just how your reaction to the film and not having that as much to say about the film?
Yes, I wasn't 100% sure what I was going to say other than talking about the like oversimplification of the politics and some of the things that I highlighted that I liked and disliked overall, but the comparisons in terms of like the atmosphere, the music, the scenes of everyday life, the pieces about how the world building and the philosophical ideas were done better in the original, those were all given to me from watching the original.
Yeah.
Funny that.
And I mean, Bateau, that character, that may be one of the worst crimes this movie commits as well, is that like I was so into that character in the original in the 1995, and it wasn't a case where it's like kind of a underwritten character in the original that they would struggle to try to make more meaningful. It's like they took a really cool character and made him less interesting. Like, how is that possible? They were handed a gift there.
Or just like, I think by taking out those key moments where he has a role as like a significant confidant, but I think more like the end where he saves her and then puts her into a child body is like super key in his character, and losing that just makes it seem like he's actually not that important.
They gave him the eyes.
Yeah, I was just about to make a joke about the eyes. Like, it looks terrible in real life.
Yeah.
I'd rather he kept his normal human eyes, or like put some sunglasses on or something.
Give him the banana clip.
Instant improvement.
You remove an actor's eyes, it's like, how much of a dramatic performance you're going to get across. That's always like the curse of like playing Cyclops in an X-Men movie. It's like, well, there goes the actor's number one trait.
People always thought that way we'd have no Mandalorian.
Good call. Good call.
Got you there, Cam. Got you there. Now, I mentioned it on my top line bit earlier on. This film has no time for any of its other characters apart from the Major, and yet has 20 minutes more in terms of runtime.
Yeah.
That was another thought. I was like, how is the original shorter?
And like Togusa, who's played here by Chin Han, like that's a character who has something to do in the original. He has a whole conversation scene that Scott, the line you quoted earlier in this podcast, that's in a conversation with him. He is, you almost wonder why even take the job. I mean, hopefully he got a decent paycheck and whatever out of it, but like there's nothing at all on the page for him to do whatsoever. He's barely in the movie.
Major gets like seriously injured at least once or twice extra in this and like has to get patched up, which didn't feel horribly necessary to me.
Yeah. And there's that like whole weird scene with like the slimy dude and like being chained to the pole and stuff. Like,
And like the flashbacks of the burning pagoda.
oh God, yeah.
But that's deep. That's deep.
I did like the moment though where she was like connected to the other augment or whatever, the bot, and like had that sequence where she was being like smothered by all of these like
That was cool.
weird figures. Like that was a cool image, very nightmarish.
See, when it tries to be slightly different, maybe reaching for a higher level of filmmaking, it gets interesting because look at you've got this canvas, you've got this whole arena to play in, and they just choose to play it safe this whole way through and just make this simplified bowl of porridge.
Well, I noticed with Rupert Sanders with his work on Snow White, like that was a movie that also looked very visually impressive, but had like no pulse whatsoever. And this is a movie like loaded with action. There's, martial arts stuff. There's a lot of, shootout kind of stuff. None of it's exciting.
No.
It's like he can kind of create these worlds, but he cannot make them feel alive.
It's interesting because I think Jarrah said it earlier. The best bits of this film is when it's just copying the original. Like that first fight sequence where she smashes through the glass and takes down the geisha bots is stunning. There's no wonder it was all over the trailers. It's probably the biggest, most expensive part of the film, and the shootout when she's in the water. But like that end bit where it's meant to be your final battle, it's all dark blue and grey, and you can't see anything. And they got the spider tank. You're trying to riff off the original, but like we see through you at this point, Hollywood. We know you're trying to hide your low budget CG by making it dark. It just looks bad.
I was also, I will have to say, after Wild Wild West, I was very unimpressed by that live action spider.
I did not think we'd get a Jim West Desperado mention in Ghost in the Shell 2017, but I'm here for it.
Another spy movie we will be covering.
Right after Valerian and the City of a Thousand Worlds, or whatever it's called. Yeah. What a double bill.
That's right.
Well, just before I think we go to the knock list, any final notes around? Anyone got anything? Jarrah, what about you?
I feel like I pretty much covered it. I will just say that I think that they should have just let a good thing be and let someone else get the rights and do it better.
Yeah, I'm not going to fight you on that one. I'm glad you got to see the original, though.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad we
me too.
brought that to your catalogue of films. Cam, any notes?
A couple things. I kind of like that they recreated the Garbage Man scene from the first film. Like, I thought that was done reasonably well, and they actually tied it into, the Binoche story briefly there. So that was reasonably effective. And then just a very silly one. When they went to Avalon Apartments, it made me think of Frankie Avalon, Scott, from Dr. Goldfoot and the Bikini Machine just a few weeks ago.
Oh, no. I'm just back to driving through San Francisco for 15 minutes now. That's a horrible flashback. I'll never quite shake that one. I'm just looking at any notes I've got. I made my Max Headroom joke, so I can't bring that back. I suppose I have a final question, and I'll throw it out to the floor. This is obviously I'm not going to say obviously a bad film. I'm sure some people enjoyed it, but we didn't enjoy it, I think it's fair to say, on a few different levels. do you think that the bad reception, the bad box office to this film, was to do with the sort of the cloud looming over the production, or was it more to do with just it being a bad film?
I think it was a combination of factors. I think that the first thing you heard about it was probably something bad. A lot of their target audience, who were Western audiences that hadn't seen the original, didn't care enough to go see this thing in the first place. So you're interesting going to just see like a Scarlett Johansson cyberpunk movie when you heard there's also this big controversy around it was, I think, taken down a bit. And then, it also was not that compelling once you were actually in the theater. So I would imagine you didn't get a lot, maybe, of repeat views or like good references from people who had to go see it.
Yeah, I'm trying to think back to 2017. If they weren't screening this for critics, that would imply that they weren't confident in the movie. And I don't remember how much of a marketing push they put behind it. I do remember seeing the trailer a few times and them really selling, the image of Scarlett Johansson in like the white suit jumping off the building. Like I remember them really pushing that. But like I would be curious to know, like, in terms of like how expensive a marketing push they put behind it. But I think it was just a mix. It was no buzz. Movie stars don't sell movies anymore, so the idea of Scarlett Johansson in a kind of murky looking sci-fi action movie is not going to guarantee ticket sales on an opening weekend just because people like Black Widow. And probably just we live in a very IP driven age where people buy tickets based on things they recognize, and Ghost in the Shell doesn't really come across as well, especially to a younger audience who would be the ones buying those tickets.
We've had quite a few female-led films recently, and a lot of bad examples. Salt 355, this, and I want better. I want more, and I want better, because I think we've had close to 100 films at this point, and I think it's like 20 female-led spy films and then 80 not, or maybe the mix is slightly off there, but I just want better for our actors. And this again is another misfire. I'm longing for. I can't wait to talk about Atomic Blonde or something like that. That will just raise the standard a little bit.
Or I feel like if this had come out now as like a streaming TV show, and they had put the effort into the marketing and like to getting people excited about the world and getting the buzz among fans of the original to their friends. Like I'm thinking like Wheel of Time and some of these other properties that have come out that had like a cult following and have attained a broader following. I also think you could have done way more justice to it, and people would have been more willing to have like a quite complex plot at this age of TV than we were in 2017 in the movies.
Yeah. If you made this like a 6-episode series or something and put the effort into really telling that story properly, could probably work. And especially if you had like more of a really strong writer behind it and showrunner versus an army of studio writers trying to kind of wrestle this thing into a 2-hour action film, you might actually have something.
I remember when we discussed the original a couple of months ago now, we had Danny from the Anime Summit podcast on, and she was telling us that, in Japan, this film isn't particularly highly regarded. Most people think the anime, the TV version, and the series is much better. The I think Standalone Complex, Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex, far highly regarded, and of course has a much longer runtime because it's a TV show, and it's able to explore these deeper issues. And that tells me that I think the 1995 was just one of those very rare occurrences of lightning in a bottle, and they just struck gold. And I think in the wrong hands, that film could have been just a forgotten anime no one talks about now, and we wouldn't have had this remake. And it maybe, even though it had 58 cooks in the kitchen, yep, that was right. It still wouldn't turn out right. So I had to check myself on that one. There, it wouldn't matter. You can have 200, it wouldn't turn out right.
Yeah, and actually Danny had never watched this version, so that also tells you something.
It does. Well, I think it's time. Knock list. Ghost in the Shell did make the knock list. can this one also make the knock list? It'd be the first time that a remake, I think, has made the knock list so far. Jarrah, you're our guest. You go first. Yay or nay? Is it making the knock list?
No, it is not.
I think it's a fair answer. It's not like you hadn't telegraphed that one for the last hour or so. I think you really built up to it, really. Yeah.
It was a solid C on like a letter grade scale.
Serviceable was my magic word. Serviceable. Cameron.
Yeah, no for me as well. Like, we've tackled far worse things. This has a few interesting merits about it, but it's such a just like nothing of a dramatic experience. And so, yeah, no.
I think it's also worth pointing out that the spy connective tissue in the original doesn't really exist in this.
Yeah, you get like the Section 9 being the sort of covert operation.
It's like counterterrorism, I think is what it's sort of billed as in this.
Yeah, but it's weird. It's one of the many things they're filing the edges off of.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we had Mary Claypool, who did organized the English dub, basically, for the 1995 version on as a guest to interview for that film, and we spoke about those sort of spy connections there, but there is nothing in this. We covered this because what we do is we cover the remakes, like with Day of the Jackal, that sort of thing. But yeah, this one was, I mean, just also to answer my own question, it's a no, not just because it definitely isn't a spy film, but also it's just a serviceable misfire. I don't think we need to really belabor it any more than that. It's a real shame because we all love the source material.
Yep, it's true.
Well, our name is Spy Hard's Podcast, and we do not consent for this film to make the knock list. I've been saving that one for quite some time. I hope you're all happy with it. And it's definitely not. It's definitely filed and marked as classified. Now, Jarrah, I want to thank you for stepping off, as I said, the Enterprise and onto the show. Where can people hear more from you?
Yeah, you can find me on the Women at Warp podcast. We're at Women at Warp on all the social channels, or you can find us at womenatwarp.com and wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Is there an episode in particular you would recommend people check out who have never listened to this show?
Ooh, that's a good question. So if you are like a Trek expert, then I would suggest diving into one of our thematic episodes. I'm particularly proud of one we did recently on colonialism and imperialism in Star Trek, with a couple of really great guests, including Professor of Indigenous Studies from Australia, Lynette Russell. So I'm particularly proud of some of those bigger thematic episodes. If you are more of a dabbler Trekkie and or you just don't want to listen to something that serious because the world is on fire, then we have a very funny episode on Deanna Troi, as well as there's one on Guinan called like Guinan Intergalactic Woman of Mystery and Hats or something. So I feel like those are some pretty accessible first listens.
It sounds like there's a spy connection with Guinan there, International Woman of Mystery, Intergalactic Woman of Mystery. I like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope the Deanna Troi episode features chocolate cake at least once.
Oh, probably. I'm sure we talked about chocolate. Yeah.
It has to be. Well, yeah, there'll be links in the show notes below for Women at Warp. And, of course, where can people find you on social media?
So I'm personally on Twitter at Jarrah Penguin. That's JARRAH Penguin.
Perfect. And we'll put links to that below. But, Jarrah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. That was fun.
Well, thank you once again to Jarrah for joining us, and we definitely recommend checking out the Women at Warp podcast, and you can find links to that in the show notes below. But Cam, what are we talking about next week?
Well, Scott, we've bounced around genres quite a bit. We had sci-fi this week. We've done various other things in the past, but we are going to have a first next week. This is going to be our first musical spy film. We are tackling 1967's The Fastest Guitar Alive, starring Roy Orbison.
For the longest time, I thought finding a spy musical was the holy grail of this search we have started to find the best spy movies of all time. And lo and behold, we've stumbled upon one. We've got a great guest joining us next week as well, to bring some musical knowledge. Because, I'm a trained musician, but Cam, I basically said you couldn't carry a tune if you tried.
No, that's true. Although, if you search the internet, you may find some podcasts out there other than this one where I am rapping the introduction music.
And if you search YouTube quite hard, you might find some clips of Cam pretending to be some certain characters and rapping about them.
Yeah. The novelty rap, I guess, is my bag, baby.
It's also great because next week is our 99th official review episode on our mainline sort of episodes, leading up to our 100th. So we thought, well, let's really go for it and go for a musical. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a ton of fun. I'm looking forward to this one as well.
Are you going to be rapping an intro for us next week, like a special celebration?
Definitely not.
Maybe one day. Maybe when we get to 101, we like launch the next 100. I'll get you to record an intro for us.
Oh boy, bringing it back. Sure.
Can you do a James Bond rap? That is the question.
I guarantee I could. Yeah.
Yeah, I really think you could. Well, there you go, folks. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to check out Fastest Guitar Alive from 1967, starring Roy Orbison himself. And join us next week. If you liked what you heard on the show this week, please consider leaving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. It just helps spread the Spy Hards love. And speaking of love, don't forget to show us some love discreetly on social media at Spy Hards. That's SPYHARDS on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. But until next week, listeners, I wasn't built to dance.